Hello and welcome to my channel. This first video I'm doing is an introduction to plant taxonomy and evolutionary biology with a brief touching upon terminology, because without these foundations I simply don't believe anything I'm saying is going to make any sort of sense. So, to begin with, we will start with plants as a whole. They first came to land approximately 850 million years ago, give or take, and are divided into many large groups. The first large group we'll talk about is something called bryophytes. Bryophytes are primitive plants, or rather primitive looking, that do not have seeds, flowers, vascular systems, or anything of the sort. They include plants such as mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Now, the introduction of bryophytes would be a really good time to talk about the alternation of generations. So, this is going to be an atrocious drawing, but you'll have to bear with me. You have the leafy bits of a moss down here, and there will be quite a few of these in a moss patch for the most part. But then, if you get to the right season, you can find something that looks like a long stick with a little bulb on the end. The leafy bits here are called the gametophyte. They have one set of chromosomes, one N, haploid, and these produce gametes. Upon their successful fertilization, these will produce this stage here, called a sporophyte. These have two sets of chromosomes, diploid, and will reproduce spores which are released from the top. In bryophytes, the gametophyte here is what is green and does all the photosynthesis, while the sporophyte here is entirely dependent upon the gametophyte. They feed it, and it only lives long enough to produce the spores. Now, this is in direct contrast to the rest of the plants, but I'll continue explaining a bit more. So, whereas an animal family tree will look something like this, plant family trees do not. They consist of sporophyte, which directly, without a partner, reproduces the gametophyte stage, and then the two gametophytes come together and produce another sporophyte. And again, 2, 1, 2. So, the rest of the plants the remainder of plants are called vascular plants, and they are greatly different than the non-vascular plants like the bryophytes. So, for example, their sporophytes are larger. So, to begin with, we have the main group, which is, or earliest group rather, not main, ferns. So, as sporophytes grew larger, so let's see, you got a fern here. This large bit here is the sporophyte. it is green, leafy, and photosynthetic, as it becomes large to reach more wind to scatter spores for a longer distance, and to reach greater heights means that it needed to be able to feed itself. And then the gametophyte here is much smaller, greatly reduced in size from how it was, and is generally very short-lived, although one is not dependent on the other in this case. And the other large benefit that vascular plants have is that they have root systems. You may notice mosses tend to live almost exclusively in areas that are dark and get a lot of rainfall, because they do not have roots and cannot extract water from the soil. The vascular plants do have roots, however, so they can live pretty much anywhere they want as long as other conditions are generally okay. Now, the ferns and assorted plants like horsetails are still missing one of the main characteristics, which are seeds. Now, a seed is basically a prepackaged sporophyte that is long-lasting and contains all the nutrients it needs to grow a whole new plant. Now, you may be wondering that where did the gametophytes go? After all, this is a sporophyte directly shedding other sporophytes. And the answer is that they still exist. By this point, gametophytes have been entirely separated into male and female gametophytes, and the male ones are called pollen, whereas females are called ovules. So, every spring, a large tree, such as, say, usually a conifer, for example, will produce tons of these, which will be then transported on the wind until they encounter these ones, which the tree holds on to in order to ensure that they survive better. Now, this adaptation was exceptionally helpful, because even though ferns are vascular plants and can survive in drier areas than mosses, the gametophytes are still dependent upon being able to mate in wet conditions, and with pollen being dispersed on the wind and coming to a different sporophyte holding its partner, that is no longer a requirement, and this is why seed plants are so much more common. Now, there are two different subgroups of seed plants. The first group is the gymnosperms, and these will include things such as conifers, and ginkgo, along with a couple of other things. Now, gymnosperms do not produce flowers. And likewise, they do not produce fruit either. They produce only cones, so such things as juniper berries, for example, are actually seed cones rather than being proper berries. And this is despite their fleshy outer appearance. Now, the other group of seed plants is called angiosperms. And these do produce flowers. So, with angiosperms, there are further two groups within them, in addition to a few miscellaneous basal ones, such as water lilies. And these two groups are the monocots and dicots. Monocots include things like grasses, and orchids, and bromeliads. Whereas the dicots include things like sunflowers, beans, and nightshades. Now, a big difference between monocots and dicots is the presence of the flowers. So, monocot flowers tend to have petals in groups of 3 or 6, or sometimes multiples of those. So, if you see a flower with a multiple of 3 or 6 petals, it is almost certainly a monocot. Meanwhile, dicots, on the other hand, have multiples of 4 or 5. And they do not usually have too many of these, although sometimes you will see quite a few. And there are some other exceptions, such as the weird setup sunflowers have. But to recap, we have 6 petals, 3 or 6 petals, monocot, 4 or 5, or multiple of those, dicot. So, with that out of the way, we can now discuss the nomenclature, naming conventions. The 3 categories most commonly used are family, genus, and species. So, to begin with, we'll use a potato as an example. The genus for a potato is Solanum. The family is Solanaceae. And note that families in plants always end in aceae. And then the species would be S. tuberosum. Now, if you want to if you have the genus already identified here, you can abbreviate it to the first letter and a dot. If you do not have it already specified, you need to write the entire thing out, because otherwise it will be quite confusing if 2 genera start with the same letter. So, if you have an unknown species, you can write Solanum sp, and if you want to referring to more than one species, you can write out Solanum spp for species pluralis. Now, some other things are that the specific epithet is always lowercase, the genus is always uppercase, and if you're typing, they should be italicized. That's just proper convention, so you know you're discussing a species and don't get confused for anything else. So, that is something else to note here, is that most families are named after a genus, although in some cases the genus name is changed and the family name will remain the same. This can get vaguely confusing, but there are only a couple exceptions where that happens, and I think it's rather easy to deal with. So, this wraps up the first episode. I intend to release videos as often as possible, and if anyone has a plant species they would like to see a video on, please let me know, and if it's not too much of a hassle to acquire, I will do so. The next episode will be about leaf types and leaf arrangements, which are helpful for identifying plants. And if anybody has any suggestions to improve, please leave a comment. Thank you. Have a great day.